Ethan Miller learned that loneliness could exist even in a shared apartment. At 24, he lived with his boyfriend Ryan Collins in a neat second-floor unit that looked perfect from the outside: matching mugs, framed photos, a couch chosen together. Inside, however, silence had begun to settle like dust. Ryan came home late most nights, distracted and restless, his attention always borrowed by work messages or unfinished plans. When Ethan spoke, Ryan listened just enough to respond, never enough to understand. Ethan told himself this was normal. Relationships evolved. Comfort replaced excitement. Still, some nights he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when feeling unseen had become routine. He missed being asked simple questions: "How was your day?" and missed even more the feeling that his answers mattered. The trouble began with something small and ordinary. One evening, as rain rattled against the windows, the living room light flickered and died. Ethan tried the breaker, then the lamp, then his patience. Ryan wasn't home yet, and Ethan didn't want to call him for something so minor. After a few failed attempts and a growing sense of irritation, he stepped into the hallway to check the fuse box shared by the floor. That was when he met Daniel Brooks. Daniel lived across the hall, a man in his early 30s with an easy posture and a calm presence that felt out of place in the narrow corridor. He noticed Ethan struggling with the fuse panel and offered help without hesitation, his voice steady and warm. Within minutes, the lights returned, but Daniel didn't leave right away. He asked Ethan's name. He smiled when Ethan answered. The conversation was brief, polite, and unremarkable, yet Ethan felt something loosen inside him. Daniel listened, not in the casual way people often pretended to, but with full attention, as if the moment deserved it. When Daniel finally returned to his apartment, Ethan stood alone in the hallway longer than necessary, surprised by how much lighter he felt. Over the next few days, they crossed paths again. Sometimes it was just a nod or a quiet greeting. Other times, Daniel paused to ask how the apartment was holding up after the storm. These exchanges were simple, yet they lingered in Ethan's mind long after they ended. Daniel didn't rush conversations. He didn't glance at his phone mid-sentence. He treated Ethan's words as if they carried weight. At home, Ryan barely noticed. When Ethan mentioned the neighbor in passing, Ryan shrugged, uninterested. That indifference stung more than Ethan expected. He wasn't seeking attention, at least, that's what he told himself, but he couldn't ignore how refreshing it felt to receive it so easily from someone else. One evening, Daniel knocked on the door holding a small toolbox. He explained there had been a building-wide notice about loose wiring and offered to check their outlets, since he'd already fixed his own. Ryan was out again, so Ethan invited Daniel in. The visit stayed practical, focused on screws and switches, but conversation filled the space naturally. Daniel spoke about moving to the city after a long relationship ended, about learning to live alone again. Ethan listened, recognizing fragments of his own unspoken dissatisfaction in Daniel's careful words. When Daniel left, the apartment felt quieter than before. Ethan sat on the couch, replaying the evening in his mind, unsettled by how much he had enjoyed it. Nothing improper had happened. No promises were made, no lines crossed. And yet, something had shifted. A door he hadn't realized was closed now stood slightly open. Later that night, Ryan returned, tired and distant as usual. Ethan watched him move through the apartment, familiar and unreachable, and felt a confusing blend of guilt and longing. He wondered why a stranger's brief kindness had affected him so deeply, and why the thought of seeing Daniel again stirred a quiet anticipation he couldn't dismiss. As Ethan turned off the lights and headed to bed, he understood one unsettling truth: the help he had accepted in the hallway had fixed more than a fuse. It had illuminated a part of his heart he had been ignoring, and now that he could see it clearly, he wasn't sure how to look away. After the night Daniel Brooks fixed the outlets, Ethan Miller became aware of how often he listened for footsteps in the hallway. It unsettled him, this new attentiveness, but he didn't try to stop it. Instead, he framed it as coincidence, as neighbors naturally crossing paths. When Daniel appeared outside the laundry room a few evenings later, Ethan felt a quiet relief he hadn't expected. Their conversations lengthened without effort. Daniel spoke with the same calm openness Ethan remembered, asking questions that went beyond polite obligation. He wanted to know what Ethan did with his days, what music he liked, what had brought him to the building. Ethan answered honestly, surprised by his own willingness. With Daniel, he didn't feel the need to simplify himself. Ryan Collins remained largely absent, physically present but emotionally removed. When Ethan described his day, Ryan responded with distracted nods or brief affirmations that ended conversations before they could begin. Ethan told himself not to compare, but the contrast sharpened anyway. Daniel listened the way Ethan had once hoped Ryan would. One night, Daniel invited Ethan over for tea, explaining that his apartment still felt too quiet in the evenings. Ethan hesitated only briefly before accepting. He told himself there was nothing wrong with companionship, nothing dishonest in conversation. Daniel's place was modest and carefully kept, marked by bookshelves and soft lighting. It felt lived in, thoughtful, intentional, much like Daniel himself. They talked for hours, the kind of conversation that unfolded naturally, without pressure or performance. Daniel spoke about his past relationship ending not in anger, but with a reflective sadness that suggested healing was still in progress. Ethan shared small frustrations about feeling invisible at home, choosing his words carefully, avoiding blame. Daniel didn't offer solutions. He simply acknowledged the weight of what Ethan was carrying. That understanding settled between them, gentle but persistent. Ethan noticed how easily he laughed in Daniel's presence, how his shoulders relaxed without effort. When he returned home later that night, Ryan was asleep on the couch, television murmuring to no one. Ethan covered him with a blanket and stood there longer than necessary, feeling both tenderness and distance. As days passed, Ethan began to anticipate Daniel's presence. He timed his errands to coincide with moments Daniel might be around, told himself it was accidental even as the pattern repeated. When Ryan asked why Ethan seemed distracted lately, Ethan deflected, unsure how to explain feelings he hadn't yet named. The line shifted quietly. Ethan found himself withholding details from Ryan, conversations, moments, the simple comfort Daniel provided. It wasn't secrecy born of intent, but of instinct. Some things felt too personal to share, too fragile. The realization unsettled him. He had always believed honesty was the foundation of love. One evening, after a tense exchange with Ryan that ended without resolution, Ethan found himself knocking on Daniel's door without fully deciding to. Daniel welcomed him in without questions, sensing the heaviness Ethan carried. They sat across from each other in silence before Ethan spoke, admitting how tired he felt trying to be understood by someone who no longer seemed to listen. Daniel didn't step closer. He didn't touch him. But his words were careful and sincere, acknowledging the difficulty of wanting connection while fearing the cost of seeking it elsewhere. In that moment, Ethan felt seen in a way that felt dangerously comforting. When Ethan finally left, the hallway seemed longer than usual. He understood something essential had changed. The boundary he once relied on, between neighborly kindness and emotional dependence, had thinned. Nothing overt had happened, yet the weight of his choices pressed in. As Ethan lay awake that night beside Ryan, he stared at the dark ceiling, aware of a growing truth he couldn't dismiss. He was no longer simply reacting to neglect. He was moving towards something else, drawn by a connection that felt genuine and risky all at once. The realization didn't frighten him as much as it should have. Instead, it left him suspended between guilt and longing, knowing that whatever came next would demand a reckoning he wasn't yet ready to face. The argument with Ryan Collins was not loud, which somehow made it worse. Ethan Miller stood in the kitchen, explaining, again, why he felt distant, while Ryan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes drifting toward his phone. There was no cruelty in Ryan's responses, only impatience, as if Ethan's feelings were a problem to be managed rather than understood. When Ryan finally said, "I don't know what you want from me," something inside Ethan went quiet. He left the apartment without slamming the door. The hallway felt cooler than usual, the air sharp against his skin. Ethan told himself he just needed space, a few minutes to breathe, but his feet carried him across the hall before he fully acknowledged the decision. When he knocked on Daniel Brooks's door, his hand trembled slightly. Daniel opened the door almost immediately. One look at Ethan's face was enough for him to step aside and let him in. They didn't speak at first. The silence between them was dense, charged with things neither had named aloud. Ethan sank onto the couch, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them. Daniel sat nearby, close enough to feel present, far enough to remain careful. Ethan spoke in fragments. He admitted how tired he felt, how small his world had become, how lonely it was to share space with someone who no longer reached back. Saying the words out loud stripped away the excuses he'd been clinging to. Daniel listened, his expression serious, his attention unwavering. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but firm, reminding Ethan that seeking comfort didn't erase responsibility. That restraint should have steadied Ethan. Instead, it made the moment heavier. He realized Daniel wasn't trying to take anything from him. Daniel was simply there, offering understanding without demand. The realization broke something open. Ethan confessed that being with Daniel made him feel visible again, and the honesty of it startled them both. Daniel stood and moved toward the window, putting physical distance between them as if to protect them from what was forming. He said they needed to be careful, that Ethan's relationship mattered, that emotions could blur lines faster than either expected. Ethan agreed, yet the words felt hollow even as he said them. The truth was already ahead of him, waiting. When Daniel turned back, their eyes met, and the room seemed to narrow around that single point of connection. No one reached out, no one crossed the space. And yet, the closeness was undeniable, built from shared vulnerability rather than touch. Ethan felt his chest tighten, a mix of desire and dread pressing against his ribs. "I don't want to be the reason you hurt someone," Daniel said quietly. "I know," Ethan replied, meaning more than he could explain. The moment passed without resolution, but it left a mark. Ethan left Daniel's apartment shortly after, walking back into the hallway with a sense of finality he couldn't shake. He understood that even without a single physical act, something essential had shifted. The choice wasn't between right and wrong anymore, it was between denial and honesty. At home, Ryan was already asleep. Ethan watched him for a long moment, noticing the familiar lines of his face, the life they had built through habit and history. Guilt settled in, heavy and inescapable. Ethan knew he was standing at the edge of a truth that demanded action, not avoidance. Lying in bed, he replayed the evening in careful detail. There had been no dramatic gesture, no clear betrayal others could point to. Yet Ethan felt altered. The connection with Daniel had crystallized into something undeniable, something that could no longer coexist quietly with his current life. As sleep finally came, Ethan understood that the hardest part was no longer what he felt, but what he would do with it. The comfort he had found had revealed the cost of staying silent, and whatever came next would force him to choose which version of himself he was willing to live with. Ethan Miller did not sleep well after the night he left Daniel Brooks's apartment. Morning arrived with a dull clarity, stripping away the comfort of ambiguity. What remained was the knowledge that silence was no longer neutral, it was a choice that protected convenience over honesty. As he watched Ryan Collins move through the shared kitchen, familiar and distant, Ethan understood that whatever love remained between them could not survive unspoken truths. He chose the evening to speak. Ryan listened with visible tension as Ethan explained, not defensively, not dramatically, but carefully. Ethan spoke about feeling unseen, about drifting instead of fighting, about allowing himself to lean on someone else when he should have demanded presence or admitted the absence of it. He did not blame Daniel. He did not excuse himself. He named the emotional betrayal for what it was. Ryan's reaction was quiet at first. Hurt surfaced slowly, hardening into disappointment rather than anger. Ryan admitted he had felt Ethan pulling away but had assumed it would pass, the way other things had. Hearing the truth forced him to see the cost of his own distance. Still, acknowledgement did not erase the damage. Trust, once thinned, did not easily restore itself. They sat together in heavy silence, understanding that love built on habit could not withstand what had been revealed. The decision to separate was mutual, though no less painful for it. Ryan packed a bag that night, pausing at the door as if searching for words that might reframe everything. None came. When the door closed, the apartment felt both emptier and strangely honest. Days passed before Ethan saw Daniel again. When they finally met in the hallway, the familiarity felt altered, tempered by what had unfolded. Ethan told Daniel the truth without embellishment, the breakup, the guilt, the clarity that followed. Daniel listened, relief and restraint coexisting in his expression. He made it clear that he would not step into a space still shaped by unresolved loss. "I don't want to be an escape," Daniel said. "I want to be a choice." The words stayed with Ethan long after they parted. He realized how easily he had sought comfort without fully considering consequence, how vulnerability without accountability could become another form of avoidance. Daniel's refusal wasn't rejection, it was integrity. Time reshaped everything. Ethan learned to sit with solitude rather than fear it, to examine the patterns that had led him to mistake attention for connection. He rebuilt his routines, this time with intention, and allowed himself the discomfort of growth. Daniel remained present but patient, offering friendship without expectation, letting trust rebuild on firmer ground. One evening, weeks later, Ethan stood at his window, watching the lights across the courtyard flicker on one by one. His life no longer felt suspended between choices. It felt grounded, earned through difficult honesty rather than quiet longing. When Daniel knocked, inviting him for a walk, Ethan accepted without urgency, without illusion. As they stepped into the night air together, Ethan understood that love, when it came again, would not be born from neglect or secrecy. It would come from clarity, from choosing fully rather than drifting toward what felt easy. The neighbor who had once helped him fix a fuse had changed his heart, not by taking something forbidden, but by revealing what Ethan had been avoiding all along, the courage to face truth, even when it cost him everything familiar.